Hi everyone. So today we are going to learn about JWT OAuth 2.0 bearer token flow. So what exactly is this flow? This is an authorization flow wherein a client presents a digitally signed JWT to the server for authentication purpose and server returns an access token for authorization. Now in any integration, what exactly happens in an integration? Why do we even need integration? So what happens is the client system wants to access some resource of server. Either it wants to access a resource or read a resource, or it wants to update a resource in server or delete a resource in server. And in order to do so, first the client must authenticate itself to the server, right? So server should know which client is trying to access its resources, whether the client is authenticated or not, or in other words, whether the client is really allowed to access the resources of server or not. So JWT is a flow wherein signed JWT is used for authentication purpose, and server validates that signed JWT, and if it's valid, then it returns an access token. So how this flow works? So if you see in this diagram, there is a client here and there is a server. So even before the integration is established, client generates a private key and it also generates a certificate. Okay, and it shares this certificate with the server. So server has a copy of the certificate which the client generated. And during the integration call, client signs the JWT using the private key. And for any system, in order to validate that JWT, it has to use a public key. Using a public key, a system can validate the JWT. But where is the public key here? So public key is part of the certificate. Okay. So since we already shared this certificate with the server even before the integration was established, so server already has public key as part of this certificate. And when the client during the integration call sends a signed JWT using its private key, what will server do? Server, using this certificate, or rather the public key inside this certificate, will validate the JWT. And if it finds that it's a valid JWT, then it will return an access token. Now let's talk about structure of JWT. Okay. So what exactly a JWT looks like? So if you see, JWT has three parts. The first part is base 64 URL encoded header, then a dot, right, this dot, then base 64 URL encoded payload, then again a dot, and then base 64 URL encoded signature. And I'll not go into details about what is base 64 URL encoding, because if I start talking about these things, the video will become too long. So just understand that base 64 URL encoding is used to encode something, right? In this case, we are encoding header, we are also encoding payload, right? And we are also encoding signature. So once you encode it, how does the encoded string looks like? It looks like something like this, right? If you see, this is encoded header, and after that you see a dot is there, right? There is a dot. Then this is encoded payload, right? And then after that there is a dot, and this is encoded signature, right? That's the last part. So this is JWT contents after encoding. But what about before encoding? What about the original content? How does it looks like? So this is this part, the bottom section. You see, there is a header, there is a payload, and then there is a signature. So what's in the header? In the header, you will see two entries. First is algorithm, ALG, and then a type, TYP. So the first entry indicates that this is the algorithm which is used to sign this JWT. And the second entry is self-evident. It says it's a JWT, right? Second part is payload. So this part is the actual data which the token is carrying. Okay. And the third part is signature. Coming back to the payload, let's understand what all these entries in the payload means. So the first entry is issuer, ISS. So issuer will be the client ID of your server, right? That client ID will be from your server. Now, if you take example of Salesforce being a server, and some client is trying to access Salesforce data, then in Salesforce we create connected app, right? And in connected app we have client ID and client secret. So that client ID is what's stored in issuer. Next is subject. So what is subject? Subject will be the username of a user in the server on whose behalf client will make a integration call to server. So for example, if you take example of Salesforce, as a server wherein some client is trying to access resource of Salesforce, so in the subject we will have the username of a Salesforce user record. Okay. Next comes the audience. So audience is nothing but your endpoint of server, right? So this is the endpoint which server will let the client know, and the client has to hit that endpoint in order to obtain the access token. And the last one is expiry. Expiry is nothing but it tells the server when the token becomes invalid, and it is in Unix timestamp format. Coming to the third part, which is signature. So what is signature? So signature, how the client prepares the signature, right? How does it signs this JWT? So what it does is it will take the header, right, in base 64 URL encoded format, then a dot, and then the payload also in base 64 URL encoded format, right? It will combine all these three, and then it will hash it using the algorithm mentioned here, RS256. So that is first part. And then it will also encrypt it using the private key. Now which private key? If I go back to the previous diagram, this private key, right? So it contains two steps. So what do you mean by signing? Signing will have two steps. First is hash to hash or hashing, and then second part is encrypting using private key. So first it will hash these two components, base 64 URL encoded header, then a dot, and then base 64 URL encoded payload, right? And hash it using this algorithm, and then encrypt the whole thing or the resultant with the private key. Now I don't want to go into details of what is hashing, what do you mean by the term hashing and encryption, because that would become too much for this video. So what you can just understand is that the client system signs the JWT, right, using the private key. As far as understanding JWT, this should be enough. So what does the final JWT looks like? So this is not the structure in which the client will send the JWT to server, right? It's not like this. This is before encoding all these things. So the final JWT, what it looks like is like this, right? This I already explained. So the first part will be, base 64 encoded header, then a dot here, right? And then again after dot, base 64 encoded payload, and then a dot again here, and after that again a base 64 encoded signature. So I explained the process of creating the signature, and that also again is base 64 encoded and included in the final JWT. So this is what is actually sent from client to server. So we keep saying this word, right? JWT. So what actually is JWT? So JWT stands for JSON Web Token, right? This is the full form, JSON Web Token. Sorry, here. And why it is called JSON Web Token? Why not something else? The reason being, there is a meaning of each term. So why JSON? Because it's actually in JSON format, right? Key value pairs, you're seeing everywhere key value pair. So it's a JSON format. That's why, this term JSON. Why web? Because it is built for web-based authentication and APIs, right? It is built for the web. That's why this term web. And why token? Because it is a self-contained packet of identity, right? So this JWT is a sort of identification, right? It's a packet of identity, and it's a self-contained packet of identity. That's why it's called a token. So that is the reason it's called as JSON Web Token. That's the meaning of this, the full name, JSON Web Token. In short, it's lightweight, portable, and signed entity built for the internet. Now, before we go into actual implementation of JWT, I just wanted to touch on a couple of points here. The first point is, why do we encode the header, payload, and signature in base 64 URL encoding? But what's the need of encoding this, right? And the reason for this is, this final JWT token, right, which is this one, is either sent as part of header or the URL, when the client makes the API call. And generally, if it is sent as part of header or URL, this format might break the integration call. The header or URL might not support this format. So that is the reason the client encodes the header, payload, and signature, everything in base 64 URL encoding. So this encoded data is now URL friendly. It will not break the integration call if it is being either sent as part of header or as part of URL. And the second point is, what does server do with this signed JWT? Yeah, so what does server do with this signed JWT? So once the JWT reaches the server, the signed JWT, what will server do? So server has, as part of signed JWT, it has got the base 64 URL encoded header, and then the payload part, and then the signature part, right? So what it will do, it will pull out the base 64 URL encoded header dot base 64 URL encoded payload, and it will hash. It will again, the server also will hash these two components of JWT, and using this hashed data plus the public key, right? So if you remember, the server already has public key as part of the certificate. So using the hashed data, right? Hashed as in it took the base 64 URL encoded header, then dot, then base 64 URL encoded payload. It hashed it using the same algorithm, RS-256, and using the public key and the final hashed data or hash string, it verifies that if the signature is valid for this combination. And by combination, what I mean is, the server verifies if the signature, this signature is valid for this public key, which the server already has, and the hashed string, right? which it obtained by hashing the base64 URL header and base64 URL payload. Okay. Now these things might sound a bit confusing, like how is server hashing the data and then using the public key, how it's verifying the signature. It might sound confusing. So I will suggest, don't get overwhelmed by these details. Generally, you don't need this level of understanding to understand how JWT works. So what I will suggest is, just listen to it, take it as an information, and just understand what the, ultimately what server does. It has a capacity to verify the signature, right? And it says, when I say verify, that it verifies whether it's from a valid client. Yeah, that's all, nothing more. Now let's move into implementation part. Okay. So what all we need for implementation of this flow? We need a client, right? We need a server, and we need this private key and certificate, right? So we need these three things to implement a JWT flow. So for us, the server will be Salesforce. Okay. Salesforce will be the server. Client will be Node.js. Yes. And how we will generate private key and certificate? For that, we will use OpenSSL. Okay. And why are we taking this combination of Salesforce as server and Node.js as client? Why not something else, right? You could say that, why not Salesforce as server and Salesforce also as client, right? Why not both as Salesforce? So the reason is, if I take Salesforce as client also, then I'll have to talk about named credentials, right? And other stuffs, which might confuse you guys. So right now, what I want you to understand is, when Salesforce is behaving as a server, right? Then how does JWT works? How does Salesforce handles JWT flow? And that is the reason I have taken Salesforce as only server and not both, as server and client. So this is an inbound call for Salesforce from Node.js, and it is an outbound call from Node.js to Salesforce. So what is this Node.js? So here is the definition of Node.js: a JavaScript runtime that lets us run backend code outside of browser. So what we are gonna do in this implementation is, we will use a JavaScript code to prepare the JWT, to sign the JWT, and make an API call to Salesforce. Now, generally, how do you run JavaScript code? You run JavaScript code in browsers, right? But here we don't want to do that. So in order for that, if you want to run JavaScript code outside of browser, you can use Node.js. And what is OpenSSL? So OpenSSL is a command line tool used to generate cryptographic keys and certificates. Okay, so all in all, we will use OpenSSL to generate private key and certificate, and it is a self-signed certificate. So what we are doing essentially is, or rather the client is, generating a self-signed certificate. The client itself is signing it and asking Salesforce to trust it. But in real world implementations, in enterprise level implementations, or in your company implementations, self-signed certificates are not used. This we are using only because we are simulating this flow in our local machine, right? So, and also the other thing is CA signed certificate, right? So mostly in real world implementations, CA signed certificates are used, and not self-signed certificate. But we don't need to use CA signed certificate to, simulate a flow in our local machine, right? So we can just use self-signed certificate here. But remember, in real world implementation, self-signed certificates are not used. CA signed certificates are used. And probably I'll not go into detail of what is CA signed certificate or what is self-signed certificate actually, and why companies don't use self-signed certificate and what is the advantage of using CA signed certificate. Maybe I'll cover that in some other video. Okay. And also I'll not go into details of how to install OpenSSL or how to install Node.js, because there are unlimited resources online, unlimited videos which you can watch and understand how do you install these two, right? OpenSSL and Node.js. What I will do is I will put a link from where you can download the installables, right? If you're watching this on my YouTube channel, I'll put a link in the description. And if you're watching this video on my website, I will put a link somewhere on the post where this video is embedded. Yeah. And also I'm assuming you already have signed up for free Salesforce developer org, right? You already have that. If not, again, there are so many videos online which you can watch, to understand how to sign up for a free Salesforce developer org. So I'll not go into, all those details. Now let's start with the implementation part. Okay. So the first step is we will generate private key and certificate. Okay. And for that, we will use OpenSSL. So how do you run OpenSSL or Node.js commands? So for that, you need to open command prompt in your Windows or Mac. In your search box in your Windows or Mac, just search for CMD or command prompt and this should open. And by default, it will point to a certain folder. Now you have to go to the folder where you want to, generate all the certificates and all. So for me, I have already created a folder, in my C drive. So first I'll go to my C drive, the root location, right? So using this command, I can go to the root location and then there I have already created a folder, JWT demo. Yeah. So this is the folder. So in my system, OpenSSL is already installed. Okay. And I've created a folder in C drive, JWT demo. And this is the place where I'll generate the private key and certificate. Okay. So this is the command, OpenSSL command to create a private key. Okay, so it's done. Now if I go to my folder, you see this is the one which got generated, private key. Okay. Now this is the command to generate certificate. So let's go to our command prompt and then paste this. Now if I go back to my folder, you have the certificate as well. Yeah. Now the second step. So we have already generated private key and certificate, and now this certificate needs to be shared with the server, right? And the server in our case is Salesforce. So even before the integration is established, we need to share this certificate with Salesforce, and Salesforce has to upload this certificate. And how do we do that? For that, we go to our Salesforce org. Yeah. And I'm already in setup. So in setup, you search for app manager. Yeah. In the app manager, you have to create a new connected app. Create a new connected app. Give this any name, JWT demo, contact email, anything is fine. Aniket Vastuva@gmail.com. This is not my real email. Yeah. And then we have to click enable OAuth settings. Now callback URL. Okay. For JWT flow, this URL is not needed, right? This is not used actually, but since it's a required field, we have to put something here. Okay. So we can put anything like JWT.flow, doesn't matter because it is not being used in this flow at all. So don't worry about this. Now this is what? Use digital signatures. This is the place where we upload the certificate. So if you remember earlier, I said, right, we have to upload the certificate in the server. So in Salesforce, where do we upload the certificate? It is this place. So let's tick this box, use digital signatures, and now it is asking you to upload the certificate. Click on choose file. And this is the certificate, right, which we generated earlier using OpenSSL. So we choose this certificate, open, and now it's uploaded. Okay, now comes the scope. Okay, so right now I will give only one scope, okay, which is manage user data via APIs. Okay, what does this mean? That if we give this scope to the connected app, that means any external system, which will be Node.js in our case, can only access or manage Salesforce resource, using APIs and not from UI, like logging into Salesforce and stuffs like that. Only using APIs, the external system can manage the data. Now, there is one more thing which we need to add, but I'll not add it as of now. I'm not adding it as of now because I want to show you what will happen if we don't, add that scope. And generally you see, in demos and all, people giving full access. We, in 99.99% scenario, we don't give full access in real world implementations. No API external client, right? No external client should have full access to Salesforce data. Full access mean client can do anything in Salesforce, right? We don't want to do that. So we never give full access. So right now I'll only give manage user data via APIs. Okay. And rest I'll not do anything. I click on save. So it's saying changes can take up to 10 minutes. That's fine. We'll click on continue. Yeah. So we have this connected app now ready. Okay, and if I scroll down, you see something here, manage consumer details. It says customer key and secret. Okay, now when I click on this, it will ask for an OTP. Let me get that. So I've entered the OTP which I got on my registered email. Okay, click on verify. Okay, now you see two things here, right? Consumer key and consumer secret. What are these? So if you remember, if I go back to this slide, sorry, not this one, rather this one, right? Remember I mentioned in the payload, we send certain data here. And if you remember in the issuer, we said we will enter the client ID of server, right? And this client ID is nothing but the consumer key. So this is equivalent to our client ID. Consumer secret is not required here. We only need the consumer key, right? So we'll copy this and save it in our sticky notes. Yeah. So now we have our client ID. We have created a connected app in Salesforce. So what is the next step? Now Salesforce or the server is sort of ready. So you will see it will not work in first attempt because I have, on purpose missed some details because I want to show you what will happen or what errors you get when you make API calls when the connected app is not, configured properly. So that is a reason. But right now we have a connected app, in Salesforce. The next step is we have to set up Node.js. Okay. Now the next step is configuring our client, which will be Node.js. Okay. So Node.js is already installed in my system. So the first step we will do is install, or rather initialize a Node.js project in our current folder. Okay, this is the command. Yeah, and if you see the folder right now, it only has private key and certificate, which we generated earlier using OpenSSL. Right now we will execute this command. Yeah, Okay, so it has done something. If I go back to the folder, it has created package.json. So this is specific to Node.js. Okay. And next step is installing some dependencies. So I will explain what does this mean, yeah, in a minute. So this is the command to install dependencies. Okay, so just press enter. It's doing something in the backend, right? If I now go back to the folder, you see some more things are getting installed. Okay, so I'll come to this. What does installing dependencies mean? Yeah. And if you remember earlier, I said that we will use JavaScript to prepare the JWT and sign the JWT and make a call to server to get the access token, right? So for JavaScript code, we will use VS Code, yeah. And I will not go into details of what is VS Code, how you use it, from where you install it, and all those stuffs. I'm assuming you are aware of that. If not, again, there are endless videos you can watch for that. Okay. So in my VS Code, I will open, our working folder. Yeah. So C drive, JWT demo, and then select this folder. Yeah. So you see it's showing all those, all the files and folders in our current working folder. It's showing private key, JSON file, certificate, and all those stuff, right? Okay, so what we need to do here now is we will create a new file here, right? Click new file, give any name, JWT underscore demo.js, because it's a JavaScript file, right? Yeah, and then I will just paste the code here, which we'll use, right? So I'll explain this code line by line, okay? And don't worry, I'll share all the code, all this code which you're seeing on screen, all the OpenSSL commands, all the Node.js commands, I'll share it with you guys, either in the description of my YouTube channel where this video will be uploaded if you're watching it on YouTube, or if you're watching it on my website, then on the post you will see a link for all this code. So don't worry about this. Okay, so let's go through this code. What are these? Require FS, require JSON Web Token, require Axios. So if you remember, why we were configuring our Node.js, remember I executed this command, npm install JSON Web Token and Axios, and I said we are installing some dependencies. So what are we actually installing is, these are sort of external libraries which we have, installed in our, as part of our Node.js project. And then we are importing those libraries in our JavaScript code. And what these library, help us achieve, right? So this will help the JavaScript code to do certain tasks easily, right? Which otherwise would have required some, some complex coding and would have been error prone. So that's what what's the use of these dependencies or external libraries. So I will, as and when we use these libraries, I'll explain what they are doing. Okay, so let's proceed. First is we are reading the private key. Okay, we are storing the private key in a variable. Okay, so if you see the first library, right, FS is initialized with this. And one more thing, if you remember in our npm install JSON Web Token Axios command, I did not import this FS, right? I only imported JSON Web Token and Axios because FS is by default part of the project, Node.js project. So we don't need to install it explicitly. That is the reason I did not include this. We only, these are not included, the JSON Web Token and Axios. So we explicitly install these dependencies. Okay. So coming to this line, we are first reading our private key, okay, and we are using the fs library, right? This const fs we have installed to this. We have initialized this variable with fs library, and this is used to read any file. It is used to read any file. Right now we are reading our private key. Which private key? Right, the question is which private key? This private key. Because why this private key is needed? You remember the JWT is signed using private key, right? And we are making all this JWT preparation and signing in our JavaScript code. So JavaScript should know, right, where is the private key. Only then it can use it to sign the JWT, right? So that's what we have to give a path to our private key in the JavaScript code. So this is that line. So this part we have to correct it. We have to point it to our private key. And where is our private key? It is in this folder, right? This is our private key, right? So let's copy the path of our private key. Yeah. So this is the folder, and I'll just paste it here, and make sure you give forward slashes. That's how the format is. Okay, so this is my location, right? C JWT demo, and inside that the name of the file is private key, right? This is the key. So I have given the path to my private key. Yeah. And next is your connected app consumer key, right? So this is actually client ID. We have just named it as consumer key in our JavaScript file. So if you remember, we copied this client ID or consumer key from our Salesforce connected app, right? And here it is, right? This is the one. Just copy this, paste it here, save it. Yeah. And next is your username. Okay, so what is this username? So this is the user record, the Salesforce user record on whose behalf the client or the Node.js will access Salesforce data. Okay, because in JWT flow there has to be a user on whose behalf the client can access server's data. So what we'll do, we'll create a user in Salesforce. Okay, so let's go in our Salesforce org and see which user we can use. Okay, so this is my Salesforce org. Okay, so what do you think, which user should we use here? Should we use a system administrator profile user? Because when you create a free Salesforce org, you already get one user, right, whose profile is system administrator, right? So should we use that? The answer is no, because in real world implementations we never use a user as an integration user whose profile is system administrator. Why? The reason is obvious, because system administrator has all the access, view all, modify all, right, everything. So we don't want the integration user, right, to have those all those elevated access. So, because what this integration user is being used for, it is used by the client, and we don't want the client to access everything in Salesforce or do whatever the client can want. That should not that should not be the case. The user should have a bare minimum access, the only access with the client needs, not anything more than that. Okay, and for that we'll not use system administrator or profile user. We will create a new user, right? And the new user will not have system administrator profile. We'll also create a new profile which will have very limited access. Okay, so first we'll create a profile, and then we'll create a user and assign that profile to that user. Yeah, so let's first create a profile. Okay, so I'm already in profiles page, and I want a profile with very minimum access, very less access, and I'll use that profile to create our new profile. Okay, so I was just going through the profiles and I saw this profile, minimum access Salesforce, and I feel this has very limited access, very bare minimum access. I haven't verified everything, but I feel it has got very less access. Okay, but in real world implementations, like, you know, in enterprise level implementations, we verify, you know, the profile which we are creating, we actually verify what all access the profile has, and if we feel that it has got some access which the client doesn't need, then we remove that. But we'll not go into all those details here. We'll just use this profile which already looks like a profile having a very less level of access. We'll clone this profile. Yeah, we will call it integration profile. Yeah, so the profile is created. Okay, next we will create the user. Yeah, so let's go to users. New user. Okay, let's name it JWT integration user. Email, we can give anything, JWT integration user @gmail.com. For our demo purpose, anything is fine. Yeah, username, let's try to make it something unique. Dot demo, right? Let's see if it takes this username. We'll see. User license, will give Salesforce, and profile, this is important, right? We'll give our new profile, integration profile. Okay, rest of the settings are fine. Let's save it. Yeah, so we have created a user, right? It's a new user with our new profile, integration profile, right? And we'll copy this username. We'll copy this and we'll go to our JavaScript code and we'll paste it here. So now we have got a user as well. We'll save it. And login URL, right? So login URL will keep this only, login.salesforce.com, because for production instance, this is a valid URL. Okay, let's keep it login.salesforce.com. Okay, now we are done with this. Now next is, you know, next section is this, which says JWT claims. Okay, so what is this section? Let's go back to our, you know, not this one. Yeah, this one. Yeah, so you remember in the payload, right? In the JSON web token, in the payload part, we had these entries which I explained earlier, right? You see issuer, right? Here issuer, sub, which is subject, audience, and expiry. Now we are preparing these, you know, this data, and this is actually called JWT claims. Okay, so if you see here, it's JWT claims. So you see, it's the same thing, ISS, SUB, sub, odd, and exp, right? It's the same thing which we saw earlier here. And you can see the values here. ISS is consumer key, which we stored here, right? Sub is username, the username of the user we just now created. So this is sub, right? Login URL is again this login URL variable, and expiry is, you know, this can be anything. Right now I have set the expiry of, you know, this JWT claim to 5 minutes. So as I said, it is a Unix timestamp, right? So this is this you can use to create that Unix timestamp for 5 minutes, right? So this is JWT claims. Right now it's just a variable, right? In JavaScript, we have not done any signing or, you know, as such. It's just, if you see, it's an object key value pair. Now the next step is where we sign this JWT claims. Okay, so what does signing mean? So I have already explained, right, what you know, what does signing means. If I go back to this diagram, so I've already explained this earlier, right, in the start of this video, that signing involves two parts, right? So we'll take the base 64 encoded base64 URL encoded header, we'll put a dot, then we'll take the base64 URL encoded payload, right, and then hash it using this algorithm, and the resultant string we will encrypt using the private key, right? So that's what we discussed earlier, right? That's what signing is essentially. And all those things, right, all these steps which I just talked about is being taken care in this single step. Okay, so and how is this possible? This has been made possible because of this library, JSON Token, right? We imported this library initially, right? And we have initialized this variable with this library. So this library is helping the JavaScript to achieve all those steps, take the base64 URL encoded header and payload and hash it using the algorithm, and then encrypt it using the private key. So if you pass all the required parameters, this library will, do the signing step, and the method it will use is sign, right? So this is the variable JWT, this is the variable top, right? And this library has got an out of the box method sign, which will do all the steps for signing which we talked about if we pass the correct parameters, right? And we are passing what all parameters. So if we go back here, right, what we need the header, we need the payload, both should be in base64 URL encoded format, and we need the algorithm to hash it, and then we need the private key, right? So if we go back here, so we have passed the payload. We have payload is what? This variable is the payload, right? We are passing the private key. Private key is what? This variable is the private key, right? Algorithm is also there, right? But where is the header? Header we have not passed. So when we import JSON Web Token library, header is by default, included as part of that. It's by default generated. We don't need to explicitly mention the header unless and until you want to override it with some other value, right? And we won't go into those details, right? So just assume that header is by default part of, when you use JSON Web Token, header will be generated by default, and which would be this thing, this. Okay, so we have given everything, all the required parameters to this method of this variable instance of the library, and internally it will do what we talked about, right? It will hash the combination of header and payload, and it will encrypt it using the private key. Okay, so this is the advantage of using libraries. If we hadn't used this library, then we would have to write some complex code which would have been error prone. So just using this library, it made our life very easy, right? So this is the use of this library. Now we are done with creating assigned JWT. So we have stored this in this token variable. Now what is the next step? We have to send the request to Salesforce endpoint, token endpoint. Okay, so what is the endpoint for to get the access token? So this is the endpoint. So first, login URL. What is login URL? This is the base URL, login.salesforce.com, and then after that services/OAuth2/token. So this is the endpoint to get the access token. Now we have to post a request from our client, which is Node.js, to the token endpoint of Salesforce, right? But token endpoint just gives the access token. How do we how do we pass the JWT as part of that for authentication purpose? So that's where this params comes into picture. And even before that, we will talk about the third library as well, right? Axios. Now what is Axios helping us achieve here, right? Axios is a library which is helping us to post the request, right? If you see axios.post, right? It's helping us to post the request to Salesforce endpoint to get the access token. So that's the use of Axios library. Yeah. And this is the endpoint, and we are passing a params here. Now what is params? If you see, params has got two parameters, right? One is grant type. So this is the grant type for JWT flow. I'll not go into details, right? Just know that this is the grant type. And the important part is assertion. Assertion will actually hold the token. What is this token? This is JWT token. Okay. Now you're seeing token here as well and token here as well. Don't get confused. I've just given the variable name as token for the signed, JWT. So this token is for the JWT token here, and this token is, in reference to the access token which Salesforce returns. Okay, so don't get confused. These are different things. So this and this are same. So this assertion will hold the JWT part, and this token is actually the part of the URL. Okay, so don't get confused with the JWT token here. So what we are essentially doing here is we are posting a request to Salesforce endpoint to get the access token, and along in that request only we are passing the JWT part as well. So what Salesforce will do, Salesforce will verify this. Okay, so all this will happen in a single call. We'll post a request to token endpoint, and in this single call only Salesforce will verify the JWT, and if it is valid, it will return the access token. Okay, so, and in order to post, we are using JWT library. Okay, and if we get a successful token, then I'm logging it with this access token, and if Salesforce verifies and everything goes fine, then we will get the access token in this out of this string in our console log. I'll show you all those things. And this is the variable actually. So once you post, right, using JWT library, when you post the API call to Salesforce endpoint, the response is received in this variable. And in order to get the access token, this is the syntax, right? Response.data.access underscore token. So this will give you the access token. If everything goes fine, and Salesforce returns the response, and we'll log it, using this statement. Now, after this, there is also a code to make the actual API call. So once we get the access token, what's the use of access token? You have to make the actual API call, right? Either to read the resource or modify or update any resource, right? So once you get access token, using that access token, actually, we make the API call. So what I'll do for now, I'll not make the API call. I'll just see whether we are getting the access token or not. So I'll comment this code first, okay? Just to keep it clean, okay? So I've commented the code. If you see, I have commented the code, the part of the code which makes the actual API call. Yeah. So right now what this code has, this code only has the part which invokes Salesforce endpoint to get the access token. Okay. Now, how do you execute this JavaScript code, right? So you go back to your command prompt. Yeah, and we'll execute this using Node.js, right? So this I already covered previously. We are using Node.js to execute a JavaScript code outside of browser. That's how we do it, right? Now I'll show you. You write node and then your file name. This is your file name, right? JWT underscore demo.js. Now, ideally what should happen? Ideally, we have done everything right. We have signed the JWT, and we are invoking the Salesforce endpoint. Ideally, we should get an access token. Okay, so let's see what happens. I'll press enter. Okay, we got an error. Invalid grant. User hasn't approved this consumer. Okay, so what does this mean? That user hasn't approved this consumer. So which user we are talking about here? So if we go back to our code, we mentioned one user here, right? The new user which we created, this one. So when Node.js invokes Salesforce, what Salesforce is saying is this user which you are sending in this request in this JWT token, this user has not approved this consumer. So consumer is another word for client, right? Client is also called consumer. So what Salesforce is saying is this user has not approved client. And what is the client in our case? Node.js. So this user has not approved Node.js, right? So that Node.js can use this user, right, to make calls to Salesforce to get access token from Salesforce. So Node.js cannot use this user because this user itself has not approved it. So what's happening here? Even though, in Salesforce we created a user and we agreed that, we'll use this user to make the call to Salesforce to get the access token, still Salesforce is saying this user is not approved. So what's happening here is Salesforce is now, Salesforce has implemented more layers of security. It's not that you just create a user in Salesforce and share it with the external system and they can use it. There are further security layers, right, which Salesforce are implemented. Whatever user you are using should approve, right? Should approve the consumer or the client that they can use this user. The client can use this user. But this has not happened here, right? And how do you think, if you want to make this work, how do you think this user will approve this client, right? If we go back to our Salesforce org, if we go back to the user, let me search for user. This is the user, right? No, not this one. This is not the one. JWT, right? This is the user. How will this user approve this consumer? This is not a real user, right? I mean, it's not a human user. It's an integration user. In your real world implementations also, you will not use a real user who can log in and approve request on behalf of client or something like this, or log in and approve a consumer. In real world implementations also, it will be a integration user or what you call a robot user, right? How will that user approve this consumer? It cannot, right? The only way a user can approve it if it's a real user and he provides access to that client by logging in from UI. But this integration user cannot do that, right? It's not a real user. You may say you will log in on its behalf and approve it, but how? You can't do it, right? There is no user interaction happening. Why? Because this JWT flow is a system to system integration, right? It's a backend integration. There is no user interaction here. There is no user coming in picture to log into Salesforce and approve anything. It won't happen if you log in as this user in Salesforce. There is no user interaction at all. That's the a typical behavior of this integration, JWT integration and other integrations like client credentials flow, right? There is no user involvement. So this user cannot approve this consumer. So what's going wrong here? What should we make? What changes should we make to make this work? So for that, let's go back to our connected app. If you remember, while creating connected app, I just kept a bare minimum setting, right? I did not change many things. So this is the connected app, right? If I go and click on edit policies, see, there is a setting by default. All users may self-authorize, permitted users. So this I did not change while creating connected app. So what it is saying is, whatever users are being used for the integration, they should self-authorize. That's what I said earlier, right? They should authorize it. They should authorize the client. But as I said, we can't do that here, right? It's not a real user. It's an integration user or a robot user, right? So what we have to do for JWT flow is, or JWT flow is, we have to change this setting. We have to make it admin approved users are pre-authorized. They don't need to authorize it manually. They don't need to authorize the client manually, right? Admin approved users are pre-authorized. So let's save this now. Now we have saved this setting, right? Now let's go back and make the call again. I'll just re-execute it. Invalid app access. User is not admin approved to access this app. Now what is this error? Why we are getting this error? So if I go back to my org, we are saying admin approved users are pre-authorized, right? And we are getting this error. User is not an admin approved, right? What is this? So even though we are saying that admin approved users are pre-authorized, but where have we mentioned here that this user is admin approved? this user, right? The user which is coming as part of this request, where have you mentioned in this connected app that user is admin approved? We are saying admin approved users are pre-authorized, but how do how do you make this connected app understand that this particular user, which is part of this request coming from Node.js, is actually admin approved, right? So that's where another setting comes into picture, which is this profiles and permission sets. So either you add the profile of that user here, or you add a permission set that is assigned to that user, okay, in order to handle this error. So what we will do, we will add a profile. And which profile, right? The profile which we associated the new user with, it was integration profile. So click on manage profile, go here, integration profile, click on save. Okay, so now what we are saying to this connected app, that all users of this profile, right, all users of this profile are admin approved. Okay, now let's go back and execute this again. Let's see if it works. Okay, again I'll execute this command. Another error, invalid request. Refresh token scope is required and the connected app should be installed and pre-authorized. Now what is this? Okay, let's see. So let's go back to our connected app. Okay, so I'm in my app manager. I will open my connected app. Yeah, view. So there is another setting which we need to enable here to make this work. Okay, click on edit. Now scroll down to OAuth scopes. So if you remember, by creating the connected app, I gave this scope, right? Now we need to give this scope as well. Perform request at any time. Let me save it, then I'll talk about it. Yeah. Okay, now it has got two scopes. Manage user data via APIs, perform request at any time. What does this mean? Okay, so if I go back to the error, what it says, refresh token scope is required and the connected app should be installed and pre-authorized. Now in JWT flow, refresh token is not applicable actually, because every time a client makes a call, a JWT call to a server, it gets a new access token, right? So refresh token is not actually applicable. What it's trying to say, even though the error says, but what this scope says is perform request at any time. That means the client can make a call to server at any time, right? And this is basically this part, offline access, that a client can make a request to server anytime. It's not that every time a client wants to make a call to server, there should be a user involved, like it should approve the request or log in and approve the request on behalf of client. It should not happen like that, because JWT flow is a system to system integration. It's sort of a offline integration, right? Offline in the sense that it's happening in the backend without any user interaction, right? User is there, an integration user is there on behalf of on behalf of which the client is making the call, but the user is not getting involved as such from UI. So that is the use of this scope, that perform request at any time, at any time from backend. It's not that user should come into picture. So that's what this error is asking for. Even though it says refresh token scope is required and all these stuffs, but actually it's looking for this scope, perform request at any time, offline access, so that even if the org is closed, no one has logged in into org, or rather no one has even logged in into Node.js also, or the client system also, right? No user is physically logged in, still the integration is working in the backend, right? That's what this means, this scope means. Okay, now Hope it makes some sense. Yeah. Now let's again execute it. Let's see what happens. Great. We got access token, right? So how it's giving the access token? Access token colon. Now if I go back to my code, that's how it is printing, right? Access token colon is what? This part is a constant, right? So this, and then the actual access token, right? This is response.data.access underscore token. So we have successfully received, the access token from server, which is Salesforce in this case. And we have also seen what all errors, the call will throw back if you, don't configure your connected app properly. Yeah. Now we have got the access token part of the code working. We are able to successfully receive the access token. Now I want to show you guys the part wherein we actually make the API call, right? Like, to get some details from Salesforce, or to get some data from Salesforce. Right now we have just, got the access token. How do we use this access token to get some data from Salesforce? Okay, so this is the part which I commented earlier, but I will change this part a bit, because if you see here, we are just querying the account metadata. We are not querying actually any record. So I can show you, with this code as well, but I want you to show, I want you to, show a code which actually fetches some record data, some account record data, right, as part of the API call. So I'll just pause the video and I'll, modify this code a bit and uncomment it. Okay. Yeah. I have modified my code now to get, to make a get call to, fetch an actual account record data from Salesforce. So if you can see, it's the the code is now modified a bit. We are passing the account ID from, this JavaScript code, and we are expecting to get back, details of that particular account. So this is a variable here, right? And this is this variable, and this variable should hold an actual, account record ID from Salesforce. So let's go back to Salesforce. I have already got it opened. Yeah. So I'll copy the record ID. You might not be seeing the, URL, but yeah, but I have copied the record ID from the URL. Okay. I go back, I pasted the record ID here, save the code. Yeah. Now I'll open command prompt again, right? I'm in my JWT demo folder, and I will run the command. Yes. So what are we expecting here? Let's go back to the code first. So if this works fine, we'll get the access token first, and using that access token, right? Using that access token, we are making an API call. So how are we using, right? So this is the, access token is saved in this response like this, right? So if you see, we are using the same thing here. We are passing this access token in the header as a authorization, in the header of this get request call, and using that access token, we are expecting that if everything works fine, we should get the details of this account, this one, right? So let's see. So I'll press enter. So we got one error, even though we got access token, right? So what happened here? Going back to the code, we got the access token. That part was already working, right? We have seen it before, but we got an error when making this get call, right? This get call, we got an error. And what is that error? API is disabled for this user. API currently disabled. Okay, let's see how to solve this error. Okay, let's open our Salesforce org. Okay, so before we try to solve this, what is actually happening? So what is Salesforce saying is, you are using a user in this API call, you are trying to invoke a Salesforce API using this user. Which user? No, this user which we created, right? This new user. You are trying to invoke a Salesforce API using this user, but this, this facility is not available to this user. That user is not API enabled. Using this user, you cannot, call a Salesforce API. That's what Salesforce is trying to say here, right? You cannot call it. You cannot call a Salesforce API using this user. Okay. So how do we resolve this? So we have to resolve this, either at the profile level or permission set level, but we haven't created any permission set, right? So what we'll do, we'll go to the profile, right? And what was the profile? It was integration profile, right? Go to this profile. Yeah. Go to system permissions. Yeah. Now there is something called API enabled here, right? API enabled. This setting is not enabled for this particular profile. So the user which is associated to this profile cannot be used to make a, to access any salesforce.com API. That's what it is saying, access any salesforce.com API. So what we need to do is we need to click edit and then take this API enabled, right? Click on save. Yeah. Now this is done and we will try again now. Okay. But before that, you might have a question, right? That if this user was not API enabled, how we got this access token, right? This access token, if this user was not API enabled. Okay. So what happens is, right, when you hit this access token endpoint, what Salesforce essentially does is it does three things. It just verifies the JWT structure and the signature and the connected app configuration. And if the user exists and is authorized for the app, right, it just verifies these three things. If these three things pass, then Salesforce will return an access token. Okay. Even if the user is, not API enabled. That is the reason that even though the user was not API enabled, still we were getting the access token. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Now, let's execute the command again. Let's see what happens. What are we expecting here now? If you go back to the code, ideally, now we have made the user API enabled, then we should get this, details of this account, right? Account record. This API call should return the details of this account record. Okay. Let's go and see. Again, a new error. The requested resource does not exist. Okay. So let's solve this one. What it is saying, the requested resource does not exist, but it is not correct, right? The resource does exist. What is this resource? The account. The account exists in Salesforce. For this account only, I copied the record ID and, pasted it here. And this resource exists in Salesforce, right? So why are we getting this why are we getting this error, right? So it's happening because this particular user, right, the new user which we are using here does not have access to account, right? That is the reason you are getting this error. Now, if I go back to the profile, and if I go back to the object settings, you see account object, no access. Okay. So I'll go back, I'll open this account. Now see, again, I'm iterating. In real world implementations, we generally don't give access on profiles. We try to give access on permission sets, okay? Especially the object level access, okay? But right now, we are not using any permission set for this demo. So I'm just, providing all the access on profiles. Okay, on account, I will give read access. That should be enough because we are just reading the data, right? We don't want to unnecessarily give create and all those access. We are just reading the data in our code, right? So that's the access we want to give. We want to give the bare minimum access. Okay, that's the principle. That's the principle of integration, right? So read access we have given. Now let's go back to our code. Let's see what happens. I'm executing again. Finally, we got the response, right? And so we got the access token and we have got the sample API call success, and this is the response. And which record? Burlington Textiles, Burlington Textiles Corp of America. It's the same record, right? Whose record ID we copied and pasted in the code. So we have got the response now. Yeah. So this is it. Now we have log the response here, right? Sample API call success rest.data. Yeah, rest contains the response data. Rest.data will give you the record details. So sample API call success, right? So if I go back to my console, this is what, right? Sample API call success and the details of the account. Yeah. So finally we have made it work. We have gone past all the errors. You have seen everything, and I think this will help you understand what is JWT flow, right? So yeah, this is all about JWT flow, right? With the Salesforce as server and client as any system, but right now we are using Node.js, right? Now before we end this video, I wanted to discuss couple of more points, some questions which might occur to you. Okay, the first is, when Node.js makes this call to Salesforce to get the token endpoint, how does Salesforce know that this is a JWT flow? It can be any other flow as well, right? Like we have other authentication mechanisms like client credentials flow and all those stuffs, right? And other things as well, other flows as well. How will Salesforce understands that it's a JWT flow? So that information is in this params, right? So if you remember, we were passing this params as part of this call for the token and for the token, right? This params, and in this param there's something called grant type. So grant type is what here? JWT bearer. So as soon as Salesforce received this call, it checks for the grant type. So if it is JWT bearer grant type, then in the backend Salesforce will switch to the JWT logic, right? And then it will try to verify all the things related to JWT, or perform all the actions related to JWT. And this is with any server, not just Salesforce. They look at the grant type and then they understand which flow it is. Okay, so that's how Salesforce understands it's a JWT flow. And what Salesforce does after that, we'll discuss that as well. Now, if you remember in the start of this video, I told you how does the final JWT token looks like, right? It looks like something like this. The header in base64 URL encoded format, then a dot, this, then a dot, and then the payload, and then again a dot, and then the actual signature. So this is what Salesforce will receive in this case, right? And what it does after that. So after identifying that it is a JWT flow, what it will do, it will try to decode this. Okay, so these are the steps which it will do. So Salesforce will decode the JWT into these three sections: header, payload, and signature. Okay, so once this is decoded, it will now this is decoded, it can read the header, it can read the payload. So if it can, because payload is not encrypted, right? It's just encoded, so it can be decoded by any system. It's not encrypted. So from the payload, right, it will pull out what? Client ID. So in the payload we had client ID, right? If I go back to my code, payload consumer key, or this, right, this client ID, it will pull out the client ID. in the payload, from the payload, and then it will get the client ID, and using that client ID it will pull out the public key from the certificate, right? How? So using client ID, Salesforce will get the connected app, right? This JWT demo, because that client ID is part of this connected app only, right? If you remember, we fetched it out using manage consumer details. So it will get the connected app, and after that it will pull out the certificate. We uploaded this certificate, right? In the starting I showed you, we uploaded this certificate, and from that certificate it will pull out the public key. Okay, so it will get the public key, it will reconstruct the header plus payload. Okay, so it has the header, it has the payload. Then what it does again, if you remember, this also I discussed earlier, it will again base 64 URL encode it, both the header and payload, and it will again hash it using the same algorithm. This will be done by Salesforce, the server. And once it gets this string, hash string, using the public key from the certificate, from this certificate, it will verify the signature. Here it will verify the signature using the public key, right? That is the next step. Now we keep saying that public key is part of certificate. So can we see this public key if we look at the certificate? Let's check. Okay, so where is my certificate? It's here, right? In this folder, certificate.crt. So if I open this, yeah, open with the notepad, let's see. Do you see any public key here? It's all encoded, right? There's no public key as such. It says begin certificate and certificate. So you can't see the information of public key actually. So what we can do, so we have command for that as well. Okay, so I'm back to my command prompt. So if I execute this command, right, so this is the name of a certificate, certificate.crt, right? So what's inside this certificate is, if I execute this command, see, you will see a sort of decoded certificate. Now you will see a lot of things: version, serial number, right, algorithm, and you will see also some information about public key here, right? Subject public key info. I'm just showing you to make you understand that public key is part of this certificate. Okay, so Salesforce also knows how to decode this, right? So Salesforce can decode and pull out the public key. In fact, there are commands. I mean, there is a command wherein you can just get the information about public key. So this is the command. So this is the public key. Okay, so I have pulled out the public key from the certificate. Okay, so that's how Salesforce will pull out the public key from the certificate. Now coming back to this, right? Once Salesforce has verified the signature using public key, what it does next? Now it will check the JWT claims. So it has, it verifies the client ID of connected app. It will check the username, right, which we gave in this sub claim. It will check if the username exists in the system, in Salesforce system, and if it is assigned to the connected app, right? These all which we saw, right? We simulated the error as well. If it is not assigned via profile, or if correct settings are not enabled, we were getting errors. So all these things Salesforce verifies. We got those errors, right? We check those things. And also it verifies if the audience is correct, that it holds the correct login URL. It also verifies if the token has not yet expired, right, in the whatever we set in the expiry claim. So that is not yet expired. So it checks all these things, and post that if everything passes, it generates an access token. Okay, it generates an access token and ties it to that specified user. So that access token which it generated can only be used by the user which we gave in the sub claim, right? SUB claim, this one. So that access token, sorry, this one, right? So that access token is specific to that particular user which we used in our JWT call, right? And also along with the access token, it returns an instance URL. So this we did not talk about that in the call to get the access token, Salesforce not only returns access token, but also instance URL, as in the instance of the Salesforce org. Okay, so but we did use this in our code. I'll show you. Yeah. So if we go back to our code, right here, when we are making the actual API call, right, to get the details of the account, the base URL we constructed using the response from the call which was made to get access token. If you see, this was the call, right, to get the access token. The response is returned in this variable response. This part gives the access token, right? And this part, response.data.instance underscore URL, gives the instance URL, and we use this to make the actual API call. Okay, so this even, we use this as well in our code, instance URL in the response, right, which is returned. So the instance URL, which is returned as part of the call to get the access token, that also we used in our code, right? Okay. So guys, that completes the walkthrough for the Salesforce JWT flow. Yeah. And I hope it's not just something you learned today, but something you can now explain and apply with confidence. So yeah, thanks for watching. Thank you.